Welcome, ladies and gents, to my very first online presentation. My name is Renáta Drávucz. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Corvinus University of Budapest Department of Political Science. As you see, what I will talk about today is, as I have labeled it, performative populism and how this new theoretical framework can be achieved by bridging the gap between the communicative and the discursive approaches to populism. Anyone researching populism will very soon face the problem that the related literature is incredibly fragmented and is therefore the biggest obstacle to populism studies. Therefore, the aim of this paper is to integrate the communicative and discursive definitions and to simultaneously situate the phenomenon in the postmodern new media environment and highlight the importance of charismatic leadership. The paper aims to bridge the gap between these different dimensions and to give a state-of-the-art review of contemporary populism and populist political communication. So as said, we can all agree that populism is not only a very hot topic these days, but is also a heavily debated concept. We can come across many different definitions. Populism as an ideology, as a thin ideology, as a style of communication, or as a tool or strategy of communication, a discourse, democratic illiberalism, and so on. There are debates as well about how it affects democracy. Nevertheless, researchers dealing with it know very well that there are different lines of thought in the related literature, one of which is rejecting all ideological connotations and is rather characterizing populism via its communicative features, thus describing it either as a tool, strategy, or style of political communication. However, when we look at the postmodern discourse theory, we find a different point of departure which arrives at the same point. Populism is mostly present in the dimension of the performative. Yet, the logic behind the two standpoints is largely different, and they are hardly ever mixed in the scholarly literature. To offer a solution to this situation, the aim of the paper is to bridge the gap between these two seemingly different lines of thought or tradition in the literature and direct the focus collectively on the discursive communicative aspects of the phenomenon. In connection with the debated nature of populism, I would like to direct attention to the waves of populism studies as summarized by Pappas. I will not go into details, but I would like to point out that when we speak about populism, it is always very important to state which authors, which wave, and which definitions we refer to avoid confusion. In this case, I wish to contribute to the fourth wave with the development of a new theoretical framework. Pappas argues that what defines populism in the fourth wave is that scholars, not being able to come to a common agreement about what populism actually is, started to measure instead degrees of populism. Thus, accordingly, a populist actor is not either populist or not populist, but rather more or less populist. In practice, degrees of populism have been assessed via content or other textual analysis of the communicative materials such as speeches, election manifestos, or populist discourse itself. This practice is also rooted in the tradition of understanding populism as a style, tool, or strategy of political communication. To be fair, it must be mentioned that this is by far not the only description of the phenomenon. No populism researcher can surpass the overwhelmingly popular definition of populism by Katzmude and the populist zeitgeist, or the large body of literature that defines populism as a threat to democracy that has its roots in a cultural backlash and ties it to authoritative right-wing parties and nationalism, especially considering that this largely mirrors the public's view about populism. To avoid the misunderstanding that often comes hand in hand with the conceptualization of populism, it must be stated where this paper stands in the literature and where it does not. Contemporary populism is largely misunderstood as it carries a negative connotation that is in fact incorrect. Unfortunately, populism has been merged with other concepts such as authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, the rise of Euroscepticism, and the rise of new nationalisms. One must not pass by the most popular definition of populism at the moment, provided by Katzmude. He argues that populism is a thin ideology, in which there is a restricted core, the people, attached to a narrower range of political concepts, and that it can be easily linked to or combined with other ideologies such as nationalism. Overall, the definition of mudde is often pictured as a minimal definition in the sense that the antagonism between the good homogeneous people versus the evil corrupted elite can be understood as the lowest common denominator that populist actors across cases and over time share with each other. Although it does not strictly belong to the communicative view of populism, it does not contradict it either. As a minimal definition, it does capture the core of populism, however, it does not fully explain the phenomenon. Another important line of literature that we have to mention is related primarily with the work of Engelhardt and Norris, who argue that the recent rise of populist politics in Western societies can be understood by the concept of cultural backlash. In this view, populist actors appeal to those who feel threatened by cultural changes and the gradual liberalization on several issues. If one wants to connect this definition with the communicative explanation of the phenomenon, it might be said that the surge of populist actors is fueled by this backlash, as it is primarily the disenchanted public who populist actors try to appeal to via populist political communication, which attempt is highly aided by the postmodern media environment. Hence, on one hand, we have a disenchanted public who has lost interest in politics and demands something that catches their attention and makes them feel involved. And on the other hand, or on the supply side, we have populist actors doing exactly that. While the media is multiplying their messages and they reach further than ever via their own social media sites. The communicative and discursive definitions of populism surpass these primarily ideological definitions of it. On the other hand, nowadays it is popular to define populism through its communicative features. This view understands populism as a particular mode of political expression which cannot be reduced to the symptomatic effects of extra-political developments such as an economic crisis or migration. Indeed, the definition carries some gradualism in it, as populist actors here are portrayed not as either populist or not populist, but rather more or less populist. In this view, what unites political actors from the wide range of the political spectrum, both from leftist and rightist parties, despite their ideological differences, is a certain way of political communication. Benjamin Moffat is a prominent figure of this line of thought, and he distinguishes the populist style from the technocratic style the following way. As we can see, he characterizes populist political style with the appeal to the people versus the elite, bad manners instead of good manners, and a reference to crisis, breakdown, or threat. Another interesting definition in the communicative tradition is the critical framework developed by Bloch and Negrin, which characterizes the phenomenon by using three categories: identity, rhetoric, and the use of media. Identity stands for representing an idealized self that embodies the difference between people and his antagonism. Rhetoric involves adversarial, emotional, patriotic, and abrasive speech through which they connect with the disenchanted public. The use of media refers to the competent use of various communication channels. Their tactics may include playing the underdog, using abrasive speech, earning media spaces by a bullying style against the establishment, and staging newsworthy political events. The communicative definition of populism highlights the role of mediatization in the postmodern era, where the value of ideology has decreased, shifting attention to the communicative aspects of politics, such as image or rhetoric, making actual political content marginalized. This setting favors populism. As politics are becoming more and more mediatized, the importance of certain styles of rhetoric is rising, as they can lead to high media coverage and therefore high visibility. However, what really facilitated the recent rise of populist actors is the appearance of the new media, which allows political actors to turn directly to the people without the mediating role of the media. In the fourth wave of political communication, politics became even more personalized and leader-centric, and celebrity politics has become more prominent as well. As mentioned earlier, when a researcher starts to look at populism from the approach of communication science, at some point he or she is confronted with another line of literature, the discourse theoretical tradition, which also argues that populism is a performative phenomenon. However, the argument behind that is quite different. This might be because this theory builds on the interpretative discourse theoretical position, which already affects the framework of our thoughts. As our time is limited, just very briefly, discourse theory argues that different interpretations of reality manifest themselves in discourses which form politics. The theoretical starting point of the discourse theory of Laclau and Mouffe, the two most prominent representatives of discourse theory, is that everything obtains its meaning through discourse. Nothing is objectively given as reality, but constructed through discursive practices. Building on the discourse theory developed by Mouffe and Laclau, some scholars have developed the discursive definition further and in the direction of communication science. And below here, this quote might be the best example of it. Declin and Stavrakakis argue that populism is a dichotomic discourse in which the people are juxtaposed to the elite along the lines of a down-up antagonism, in which the people is discursively constructed as a large powerless group through opposition to the elite, conceived as a small and illegitimately powerful group. Populist politics thus claim to represent the people against an elite that frustrates their legitimate demands and presents these demands as the expressions of the will of the people. We can see that the focus here shifts from the contents of populism to how it articulates those contents, and we can also see a move away from ideology. Populist actors in this view construct the people that they claim to represent via discursive communicative practices. To demonstrate how populism can be characterized as a discourse and to clarify a common misunderstanding which treats it as equal to nationalism, we will turn to the discourse theoretical conceptualization of populism and nationalism, which highlights the difference between them and thus helps us to understand populism from a discourse theoretical point of view. As this little table shows, in populism, they speak for the ordinary people or the common man, portrayed as an underdog, and portray its antagonism as a hierarchically upper group. This structure is precisely what differentiates populism from other discourses that use the people as a signifier, such as nationalism, where in contrast the spatial orientation is horizontal, in or out. In spatial terms, populism is structured around the hierarchical down-up axis. Another very important part of populist literature deals with charismatic populist leadership. Urbinati actually argues that without the presence of a leader or a centralized leadership that seeks control of the majority, a popular movement that has a populist rhetoric is not yet populism. Overall, the charismatic populist leader has a crucial role in both the communicative and the discursive dimensions. Charismatic leaders are the spokesperson of the vox populi, and therefore they provide a direct form of representation. The disenchanted public do not just merely follow their leaders, but also develop an emotional connection with them, and can feel recognized and empowered through them. A discursively created group is unified symbolically around one individual, the leader. In charismatic leadership, leadership becomes personalized. Therefore, we can observe a shift from the program-oriented competition towards personalized campaign. Charismatic leadership can be understood as a consequence of mediatization and a prerequisite for populism, especially if we talk about populism in its performative dimension. As the fragmentation of the related literature is the biggest obstacle in the study of populism, it has become crucial that we try to bridge our existing definitions and move past the continuous debate. By reviewing the communicative and discursive definitions, this paper finds that they have something crucial in common. In fact, that they move away from ideology and analyze populism at the performative level. So they do not focus on the contents of it, but on how those contents are articulated. Thus, this paper suggests that these two conceptual traditions should not be separated, but rather merged in future analyses of populist political communication, thus providing a new theoretical framework which takes in consideration the specificities of the mediatized postmodern era and its consequences on populist leadership as well. This was the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that you enjoyed it.